It doesn't matter if you're using a hyperliteral translation, such as the King James Version or the New American Standard Version. It doesn't matter if you're using a dynamic equivalent translation. It really doesn't matter. Regardless of what translation you're using, there are always going to be things that are left behind because the languages are different and you just can't incorporate everything into it. Regardless of what translation you use, it's never going to be perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect translation. Take the King James, for instance. In 1611, it was an update to a already really good translation, namely Tyndale's English translation from 1526, I think it was, thereabouts. And it was a good translation then, and it was updated for 1611, and it was great in 1611. But today, we don't use those words, which means that the language in this is just incredibly archaic, very difficult to understand, and completely different. You end up with a Bible language that's distinct for the Bible, separate from the English you use in everyday language, just to read the King James Bible. Now, there are other good translations, like the New American Standard, but even there, the New American Standard is not perfect either. And if you argue, that some do, that the King James is the gold standard for literalness in terms of its relationship to the original Greek, then everything from that point on just drifts into the wrong direction anyway. And the New American Standard Translation, which I really like the New American Standard Translation, it also has its problems. The one that really gets me the most is what we find in Galatians chapter 3, verse 29. All through chapter 3, the focus is on this sperma in Greek, sperma. And it means seed, right? And many translations, or at least the New American Standard, translates that seed all the way through this passage, which gives you all of the Old Testament significance to that word. And then suddenly in verse 29, for some unknown reason, they translated descendants. And you lose the whole connection with what's taken place in the first part of this passage. And which means then that the whole impact, that last verse, is where the impact is supposed to be for you as a reader, and you lose it on that last sentence. It's completely nuts. Now, the ESV doesn't have quite the same problem. It doesn't translate sperma as descendant there. It translates it as offspring, but it does this consistently throughout this whole passage. And I think this is problematic in the sense that actually it doesn't really capture the Old Testament sense of this word. And admittedly, the Old Testament sense of the word and this New Testament sense of this word is different to the way we would use seed today, because today we use seed just generally to refer to that which is a plant, and it drops seeds and those seeds grow. And certainly from the ESV point of view, when it uses the word sperma, it will translate it seed when it relates to a physical seed that we would normally call a seed. But when it refers to the seed of a woman, it is always, generally, it's going to normally translate it as offspring, once or twice as descendants, but it's not going to capture that Old Testament sense of seed. Now, you can argue that that's archaic language, but hey, that's part of the challenge of creating translations. And maybe you would argue that the New King James is the solution to all of this. And well, yeah, okay, it's good. At least it was updated in the 1970s, but I would argue that it's still a little wooden in places. It's still a little too hard to read for the average person, and it's not as good a translation as some of the dynamic equivalent translations from a readability point of view. Is that all it really means? That you have to get a dynamic equivalent translation? No. The whole point of this is not to say that there's anything wrong with these translations in and of themselves, as good as they are. The problem is that if you're counting on these translations to get as close as possible to the Greek, you're always going to be disappointed because you just can't get to the Greek through the English. Greek is an inflected language, which means you can put words in a different order to suit your own purposes, and English requires you to have the words in a certain order for it to make sense in English. So Greek and English are very different. Greek and English don't use verbs the same way. Greek is an aspect-oriented language, whereas English is a tense-oriented or time-based language. How do you fit a time-based language into a language that really doesn't care about time the same way? How do you take aspect and translate that into a language that really doesn't care as much about aspect as much as it does about time? And Greek uses ideas and idioms in the original Greek that we don't have equivalents of in English. And so we have to fudge it. We have to do our best to just make these things work. And on top of that, Greek words themselves don't mean the exact equivalent of what an English word means. And this is one of the reasons why people are so fond of word studies, because word studies provide this hope that you can actually understand what a Greek word means and actually find an equivalent English idea that matches to it. But this is not really that easy in many cases. Even just taking the Greek word logos, which means word, right? It doesn't always mean word. Often it has philosophical connotations to it, thanks to Plato from the 5th century BC, such as in John 1 verse 1. You've got philosophical overtones. You can't just translate it word and think, well, it just means a word. That's not the point in John 1:1. And so there are just concepts in Greek where this Greek word doesn't match exactly this Greek word that we give it in our memorization of what words mean. And so this means then that we can't just take the ideas and concepts, match them together and say, well, this is what was meant. There's a lot of work to be done to understand what's going on in the original languages. So the bottom line is that regardless of what translation you use, whether you use a literal translation or a dynamic equivalent translation, there are things that your translation must leave on the cutting room floor. You cannot bring them into your English translation. You have to leave them in the Greek. You just can't transpose that into English at all. What does that mean for the average person? You may be somebody who might want to be involved and learn some Greek, do some Bible study, but you don't have the time to commit, or you don't have the interest in really diving into things at that level of detail that you need. Now, today, we are really fortunate because we have so many resources that have been written, particularly for the English language, over the last 500 years that we can take advantage of that make some of these things available to us to actually understand. And these will allow you to go beyond your English translation. For instance, the Greek text itself of the New Testament is widely available for free. You've got the SBL Greek New Testament, you've got the Byzantine Greek New Testament, both of which are widely available online in digital format or even on print format for zero cost or very, very low cost, even if you want it bound really nicely. But of course, if you don't know Greek, how do you use those texts? Well, it's true that you're always going to be limited by your lack of knowledge. There are ways of getting details from the original languages, even if you don't know the original languages today. Now, you're never going to be as well off as if you learn the language properly, but at least it gives you some insights into what you could possibly learn. For instance, you can do word studies. And of course, it's not as easy to do as just like looking something up in a dictionary, but it is possible to use resources, to use even Logos Bible software or other Bible software like Accordance, to do Bible word studies, to look at a Greek word or a Hebrew word or an Aramaic word for that matter, and to look at the way it's used in such a way that you can understand the breadth of its meaning within the different contexts in which different authors use it. And that can be really helpful and really bring a lot of insight to your study of the Word of God. Not only this, but you can also do a lot of work around sentence construction. You can actually look at a Greek word, even just using something like an interlinear Greek New Testament, you can see how the differences between the Greek and the English are structured. You can see where the Greek author puts something at the front of the sentence, sometimes because he really wants to make you focus on that, and then you can see how that actually brings out the meaning of the text. And if you understand a little bit about how verbs work and the different verb forms that we find in the New Testament and why they're used, this will also give you insights into the structure of the text and the way the verbs are working in the context and why these things are done the way they are. And this allows you to do things like sentence diagramming, to pull out the structure of a sentence in a visual kind of form so that you can kind of see the flow of the author's argument, where his main points are, where his subordinate points are, what are the things that connect to different elements within that argument, and how and why. When you see repetition, when you see the same word multiple times, or even the same root multiple times, what's the significance of that? You can do work to actually uncover all of this material, even if you don't know Greek in many cases. And not only that, there are piles of resources that help us today to uncover all of this. There are fantastic exegetical study guides. there are commentaries, we have books on backgrounds, we have books on, geography of the Bible lands, really, that are really going to help us to dig in and to understand what was going on in individual scenes and in individual texts. How have other commentators who do know Greek really well thought through this text and what conclusions have they come to? So we live in a time today where there are lots of resources available to us. But if you're interested in learning how to put all of this together, but you're not committed to learning Greek yet, then we actually are introducing a brand new course. We're calling it the Basic Greek Skills course. And the idea behind this course is to give you some of these basic skills like word studies, like sentence diagramming, like breaking down a text, without having to go and commit yourself to learning Greek. And this is not a long course. It's about you could do it in 3 weeks without breaking a sweat too much, and that's kind of how we're going to structure it the first time. But we're introducing it for the first time this weekend at an introductory price with additional bonuses, which we will talk about once we get to that stage. By the time you finish this course, you'll know how to pronounce Greek words properly using modern pronunciation. You'll know how to do a word study properly, what pitfalls await you there and how to avoid them. You'll find out how Greek words function. You'll know which words to focus on in your word studies. You'll learn how sentences are structured, how clauses are built, how phrases are developed, and how these relate to one another within a text. And you should be able to do a sentence diagramming to a reasonable degree of reliability by the time we're finished. And not only that, but we're also going to talk about all the different resources and how to use them at every stage along the way. And I'm going to give you my particular recommendations that you can also work with as you do things like word studies and sentence diagramming and Bible study generally, so that you can use the best resources and avoid the ones that really aren't as good. Hint, that includes Strong's Concordance and dictionary. Let's just get rid of those. If you're interested in finding out more about this, it's all going to be happening in the next 24 hours. bma.to/gbc waitlist is where you can get on the waitlist to find out more about it. It's going to be available for an introductory price this weekend. So if you're interested, bma.to/gbc waitlist, and let me know in the comment section below what you would like to learn in a course like this. I look forward to hearing from you below and even incorporating your ideas into this course to make it even better for you as well. Thanks so much for watching. Watch out for the next video next week, and also for this course dropping over the next few days. Look forward to serving you in the next video. In the meantime, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. We'll see you again soon.